Fashion is an industry that I love, and it's an industry that has had and continues to have an extraordinary journey. And I'm going to try and just talk you through a little bit of that. But, suffice to say that it started off pretty well. It started off with beautiful stuff that was cherished and loved by people. It started off sustainably. Mostly it was pretty ethical. It went through some ups and downs in that respect. But, it created a lot of wealth. It created a lot of well-being. It paid for many of the buildings that that are on this campus, and probably this one. I mean, the name suggests that it did. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of the evolution of our industry, because from being something that was so wonderful at this moment in time, I don't believe there's ever been a moment in time when it has been under closer scrutiny. There have been 3 documentaries on the BBC in the last month alone that have talked about clothing and textiles in a fairly negative way. And, my belief is, for certain, that there are large parts of our industry that are pretty broken, but I believe that we have a fantastic future, and I think we have a future that continues to fill people with joy, but works in a way that is much more harmonious with nature, and actually works in a way with our own communities in this country, that will create economic prosperity and create great enjoyment in the product for many, many years to come. So I'm going to give you a little potted history. That's me. Well, it's not me. I'm much fatter than that, but and my beard's a bit slimmer. So sort of roughly 30-odd thousand years ago, we were walking around naked. I'm always nervous talking to a room full of academics. You're not all academics, but many of you are. So if the facts are wrong, I apologise. I'm quite thick. I tried my best to research it, but we sort of know roughly when we started wearing clothes because of flea DNA. Apparently, somebody else in this room might know that better. But we walked around naked, and then we kind of were like, "Oh gosh, it's cold here." And so we sort of looked around, and we looked at the skins of the animals that we'd eaten. And so some bright spark whittled a needle out of a bit of bone, and we took the hides, and somebody did some clever work. We probably peed on them and dipped them in something, and hey presto, clothing is invented, and we all feel very, very clever with ourselves. But obviously we're only, we wear it until it falls off our back, and then we, skin another one and carry on. And so all, I hesitate to say it was sustainable and natural and all that stuff because it feels a bit glib, but that was the truth of it. And that's where it started. By the sort of Egyptian period, technology had moved on dramatically, and we were spinning and we were weaving in a rudimentary fashion, but the quality of our clothing had gone up enormously, and but we were using still natural materials. So it was flax, cotton, wool were all being spun and woven into clothing, and of course all we did was make togas out of it. But again, we thought we were quite clever, and we were. I'm skipping through this quite quickly. The 1500s, here we are. I chose this period because this was, again, a sort of fundamental change. Before it was a bit sort of bartered backwards and forwards, and I do the spinning and you do the weaving and somebody else puts the clothes together, and it was all, that sort of Marxist thing where, the value of the product is the value in the work, and my labour and your labour are of equal value, and we exchange goods between ourselves. And then this is the sort of dawn of kind of capitalism. And this again was a fundamental shift in sort of everything that we did. But by this point, merchants were financing the production of clothing, and a lot of textiles were being manufactured by farm labourers in the quiet times in the agricultural calendar. But, textiles were being commissioned by merchants, and they were kind of managing the whole supply and marketing of all of this stuff. But the truth was that for most people, new clothes were a complete and utter no-no. Nobody, ordinary people could not afford new clothes. Most people were wearing clothes that were second or third hand or fourth hand. There was a whole industry behind repurposing and fixing and what were called clobberers, were specialists in patching up knackered clothes and people that could take stains out. It was a big business. And only rich people could afford new clothes. I mean, actually really quite rich people could afford new clothes, and everybody else wore second-hand, which wasn't much fun if you liked clothes or being warm or clean. Don't know why there's a dog on there. Okay, we fast forward again, another 350 years, but we've gone through the Industrial Revolution, and of course all of that was happening all round here. By the 1850s, we have automated spinning and weaving. We've invented the sewing machine. We've invented the factory system, and all of that stuff dramatically changes the price of clothing. And it also actually increases the quality of clothing, which is, of course, a great thing. So all of a sudden, ordinary folk could afford to wear new clothes. I mean, they weren't cheap, but they were affordable. And most people could afford to buy something new. At this point in time, this was also, this was the dawn of, ready-to-wear clothing. This is also the dawn of consumer fashion. So department stores and retailers were selling clothes. As I say, all of a sudden, it was something that everybody could afford rather than the super rich. So that was a fundamental change. Now, in the early 1800s, when I did this slide, this was one of the slides I did for TED. The publisher was in Leeds. It's just a nice little circularity. I didn't put it up there to flatter you. In the early 1800s, the factories that were producing this wonderful clothing were, let's not beat about the bush, awful. These were awful places. People died in these factories. They were grim, they were unsanitary, they were unhealthy. People, men, women, very young children, worked extraordinarily long hours for very little pay. And, this was the dark satanic mills, this was air pollution, this was rivers filled with awful dye-stuffs. Remember all of this? Does it sound familiar? I mean, all of this stuff we were, as consumers in this country, horrified by. We were outraged that all of this stuff was happening to produce the clothing that we wore. So we legislated against it. And, we were groundbreaking in the creation of laws that protected factory workers and created good conditions for people to work in, for very good reasons. But all of that regular employment created a great deal of prosperity. And what was really fascinating at this time was that all of the money that was generated in the textile and clothing industry, all of that money stayed local. This was the time when Lancashire and Yorkshire were producing the vast majority of the world's textiles. And the money that was generated from that not only went into people's pockets, but the owners of these mills were local too. In 1850, 80% of mill owners in Lancashire were born in Lancashire. The mill owners in Lancashire and Yorkshire lived in the towns where their factories were based, and the money that they spent went back into the local economy. And not only that, the money that they made as profit came back into these communities as well, and paid for extraordinary civic buildings, paid for universities, paid for textile institutes, and paid for technical institutes, rather, and paid for hospitals and parks and all these wonderful things. The textile industry had an enormously positive effect And largely because those people that owned those businesses lived in those communities, and it flowed round and round. And this is what Adam Smith, I think, was talking about when he talked about, the positive benefits of capitalism. That was that circularity that he envisaged, where, the money from wages went into consumption, the consumption created profits, and the profits went back in, and it was all very circular. And that worked rather nicely. And at this time, you also had the rise of, the paternalists. These were enlightened mill owners who created essentially utopian communities around their factories. These were smart people. They built fantastic housing for their employees. They built bathhouses and libraries and lecture halls and cooperative stores. Places like Barrow Bridge, just outside Bolton, and this is New Lanark, which is now a World Heritage Centre, which is in Ayrshire. I mean, these were extraordinary places, and these mill owners understood that happy workers were productive workers, and that was a great thing for everybody. The other thing that was notable about this period, beyond the fact that, now you had affordable stuff and that, the profits from all this industry were coming back and creating prosperity for lots of people, was that pretty much everything that we bought and used was made locally. So there was almost nothing that was, so the raw materials might have been imported, but, the production of all the stuff that we used was local to us. And, and most of the stuff was of fantastic quality. But that didn't last for very, very long. Okay, I'm making another big leap forward. That actually is me. When the designer in my studio, I had him help me with these slides. He thought it was amusing to actually draw my face on these. The reason we did these illustrations, interestingly, was actually just to avoid copyright on the pictures, because when you do a TED talk, you're not allowed, you have to look down. Anyway, so I think they're rather nice, but they were done just to save the bother of tracking copyright down. The 1970s, and again, there will be arguments about this, the date of this transition. But this, again, was another sort of fundamental shift in the clothing and textile industry. And up until this point, as I say, most of these businesses were locally owned, and all of a sudden in this period, the 60s, 70s, 80s, there will be people here that know more than I do about this. You had an enormous consolidation in our industry, particularly the textile producers. And you went from a situation where you had lots and lots of family-owned mills distributed all around Yorkshire and Lancashire to a completely different situation where you had a couple of behemoths. You had, Courtaulds of this world who were very differently owned. They were owned by shareholders, and those shareholders were not really interested in the well-being of the people of the town of Blackburn or Halifax or wherever it happened to be. They were, for correct reasons, because many of them were institutions like pension holders and so on, those shareholders were interested in profit, and that drove a very different set of behaviours from our industry. It also, the 1970s, believe it or not, because we think fast fashion is quite a recent phenomenon, the 1970s saw Topshop, Zara, and Primark were all founded in that decade. H&M was actually founded in the early 50s. So this was a period of really quite dramatic change. So this was the period in which, obviously, man-made fibres had become very commonplace in clothing by this stage. This was a big shift away from natural fibres to man-made fibres. And the great thing about man-made fibres was that they could be dyed very easily. They could be produced relatively quickly and cheaply. And this was also the period in which we started to move our production offshore. And there were various things done by government to try and prevent it, and in a funny roundabout way, moves by government to protect our textile industry ended up killing both the textile industry and the clothing manufacturing industry all in one go. But this was the time in which, made in Hong Kong started to appear frequently in the labels of our clothing, and keep away from flame. We didn't have, wool's a lovely non-flammable material, but certain synthetics burn like billy-o. And that was a fundamental shift. Okay. Today, we all know where we are today. The smartphone, the internet, social media, all of that stuff has fundamentally changed again the way people consume clothing. And the arrival of a new breed of online fast fashion businesses has once again created another downward shift in the price of clothing and, in my opinion, the quality of that clothing. We have never been able to buy clothes for less money than we do now. You call it affordable, you call it cheap. But clothing has never been more affordable or more cheap. In 1850, a dress would have cost a week's wages and would have been worn for years. And today, a dress costs less than half an hour's pay and might be worn once, never. All of a sudden, the decision-making behind purchasing clothing has shifted so seismically that I can sit on the bus and buy a bit of clothing for the same price and with equal convenience as buying a sandwich or a cup of coffee. And that has fundamentally changed our perception of the value of clothing. And what are the results of that? Well, one of the obvious results is that if we don't value it, we don't really worry about throwing it away. Apparently, the average person in the UK, so that is the average of all of us, young and old, fashion lovers and non-fashion lovers, on average, we throw away 15 kilos of clothing each. So if you imagine what that looks like, that's quite a big, if you take the heavy stuff like the books and the sponge bag and the shoes out of your suitcase, that's quite a big suitcase full of clothing. Every single one of us chucks away every year. And quite a lot, although it might be as little as 7%, but quite a lot of that clothing finds its way into landfill. Certainly, a lot of it, we have to find ways of dealing with. And in this country, we have a well-established system for dealing with waste clothing. In many other parts of the world, they don't. In many parts of the world, nobody even is paid to collect rubbish. So, we are in a situation where an extraordinary amount of clothing is being thrown away. Now, all of that clothing uses resources that are finite. If it is made from an oil-based fiber, that is a very finite resource. And, the production of that fiber and the production of that piece of clothing and the textile that goes into it all uses resources. And all of those resources. And it creates, a certain amount of pollution. And depending on where it's made and how much those producers are paid, it can be an awful lot of pollution. And this is a problem, again, that we are relatively recently waking up to the extent of. Who here has watched a documentary called The True Cost? Okay. Yeah, I'd advise you, if you're interested in clothing, to watch that documentary. It's on Netflix. I mean, you could watch the trailer, which is about 2 minutes long, and get a good sense of what it's about. There are loads of fantastic clothing factories and textile factories in China. They have invested huge amounts of money in building state-of-the-art factories in that country and produce some very, very good quality product. But People like the aforementioned that are selling you a £5 dress, they can't afford to make stuff in the good factories in China. They are moving production to countries like Bangladesh and India and Cambodia and Vietnam at quite a significant rate. The production of clothing in all of those countries has gone up quite significantly in the last year. I think 9%, 7%, 6%. I can't remember which order. But, you know, China's wages have gone up 300% in the last decade in the textile industry and clothing industry. And that's now too expensive for the cheap end of the fashion world. I would advise you to watch The True Cost. You'll see this. This is a slide from that. The previous one was, the landfill one was as well. There's another fabulous documentary called Machines by an Indian documentary maker called Rahul Jain, which is about an hour and a quarter without any voiceover, just taking you through a print works in Gujarat. And there are a couple of conversations with workers. There's a conversation with the factory owner. It's an enlightening little documentary. If any of you watched the documentary that the BBC aired last week? This week? I can't remember what day it is. Maybe it was this week. Maybe it was last week. Stacey Dooley investigated the clothing industry. And what she discovered was something that many of us have known for about 25 odd years. Cotton is a thirsty little beggar, and the production of cotton clothing is creating deserts where fertile land, and in this case, quite a big lake, used to be. That used to be the Aral Sea. They dammed the river that ran into it to divert the water to irrigate cotton farms in Central Asia. And the result has been pretty devastating. They reckon, depending on who you listen to, somewhere between 500 and 1,800 gallons of water are required to irrigate the cotton plants to produce one pair of jeans. The 500-gallon is Levi's estimate, so you can reckon that's probably on the low side. The 1,800 is probably some exaggeration, but the truth will be somewhere in between those two. And it's an awful lot of water. We produced about 25 million tons of cotton last year to feed the textile industry, most of which is for clothing. To put that into context, I just had a quick Google on this morning, actually. In 1860, I reckoned from some data from American cotton production, which at the time was about half the world's cotton production, there was probably about 1.5 million tons of cotton being produced. And at that point, they'd already started to get reasonably agriculturally advanced with it. You know, so the world is now producing 25 times as much cotton as it did in a period where it had already started to industrialize its agriculture. You know, the natural ability of the planet to grow cotton is probably at a number that's lower than that. We are using a massive amount of cotton, and the cheaper it is, the worse the practice in creating it. There's lots of good cotton, by the way. You know, there is still cotton that is nicely grown, organically grown, sustainably grown. You know, there are regions where cotton is produced naturally, but that's expensive. You know, all of this stuff boils back down to the cost that we are prepared to pay for stuff. So that's one of the knock-on effects of cheap cotton. Another issue that is definitely à la mode is the issue of plastics. And, you know, I studied material science here. Polymers was a big part of what we did. You know, and plastics have, you know, transformed many areas of our life. They create, you know, we create life-saving devices, planet-saving devices out of plastic. But it is our use and our consumption of cheap plastic as a, you know, throwaway plastic that is creating this issue. Now, thanks. I read an article I don't know when it was, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, that talked about an issue that, this stuff is all very obvious. Like, we can see bits of macro plastic bobbing around, and we all probably all of it. Who didn't watch Blue Planet 2 last year? It's probably easier to do it that way. One hand. What were you doing? Were you in a coma? So yes, I mean, that literally was for those of you at the front, one hand went up. So we all saw, the turtle, we all saw marine life choking strangled by plastic, plastic bags and all sorts of discarded stuff. And then Liz Bonnen did a really good follow-up documentary that aired a couple of weeks ago on Monday, which if you haven't seen is worth watching. But what was great about that was she talked about ways that people were trying to solve the problem too, whereas the first one was just, this is a big issue. I read an article that was a little disturbing, and it talked about not the big chunks that are floating on the surface, but was talking about what it called microfibers. So when we wash our clothes, small fibers become dislodged from the textile from which they're made and work their way through to the water filtration plants. And those our washing machines at home don't have filters which stop this stuff, but our water treatment plant, now the experts are in the room here, so I'm going to try and tread very carefully here. But this stuff eventually makes its way into the oceans, and there is an estimate that as much as 15% of the plastic in the ocean comes from this. Now, I hesitate to say that because this is really new stuff, and Leeds University is one of a very small number of people that are investigating this. And actually, this was the clothing industry that, started looking at this issue itself. We don't know. This is clearly something that needs a great deal of investigation. It's great that the people that are doing, are at the forefront of doing this work. Two of them are in this room. Put your hands up. No, but it's happening, and we will know more. Provided all the funding is in place, we will know more in a few years' time. But there is clearly an issue around the way we use and consume plastic products, and clothing in various different guises is a plastic that is under the microscope right now. The other thing is, the other really, really big thing, and this is a thing that's, really personally important to me, is what has happened to all of that lovely industry here in Yorkshire and Boo over the border in Lancashire. This is, and I can't remember the name of this mill, but this is here in Leeds somewhere. Sorry for not knowing. It's on the bottom of my slide. Where's my little note? I'll have to exit. I'll tell you afterwards, once we stop talking. But this is, to those of you that live in this area, this is not an unfamiliar sight. In 1950, and it took a bit of guddling about. That's a Scottish expression. It took a bit of guddling about to get these numbers together, and it wasn't very easy. But I think I've cobbled together something that I can comfortably say in public in front of people with a brain. But I reckon there were probably about 1.6 million people working in the production of textiles and clothing in the UK in 1950. A good number of them, as you can see. My little laser work, I bet it. Oh, look at that. There we are. That's us there. There were some big clusters, and I've tried to be reasonably precise. I mean, of course, there were bits of mills and things and factories producing clothing pretty much everywhere, but these are the bigger ones. I think there's about 40,000 people left working in textiles and clothing in this country now. And I think most of those are still working in woolen textiles, I think. There are certainly there's a few working in technical textiles, Cotton textiles have almost completely disappeared. I reckon there are fewer than 1,000 people working in cotton textiles from about 600 odd thousand in Lancashire. And in places like Blackburn, where my factory is, you see the effects of that. You see it all across Lancashire. You see it across Yorkshire too. There are towns where these businesses were the lifeblood of these towns. I mean, we were talking, in many towns in Lancashire, places like Burnley, for example, almost half of the entire population, men and women, worked in the textile industry. And all the rest of it that supported it probably accounted for another 10, 15% of those people. This was an enormous, enormous shock. And I think there's something we can do about it. So today's fashion, what does today's fashion look like? This is a fairly sort of aggressive, punchy set of descriptions. Excessive consumption. I mean, I certainly think we consume far more than we need. I mean, this last year we spent over $3 trillion globally on clothing. That number is double the number from 10 years before. And clothing has got less expensive, and that's a dollar number, so we're consuming far more than twice as many items of clothing than we were a decade ago. I mean, it's not got colder or hotter, it's not, we're not all of a sudden wearing, we're all dressing much the same, so we're just buying more of it. We know about the waste. We know about the environmental damage that our industry does. We know about, we know about the wages in the countries that the bottom end of our fashion industry produces at. I've seen pay slips on the desk of an HR director in a very good factory in India that produces for some pretty well-known brands, and I've seen wages as low as 6 pence an hour on that desk. And so there are definitely people getting paid less than that. These people cannot possibly. There is an argument, and I think it's quite a good one because it has worked in other places, that textiles is a relatively low barrier to entry industry at the sort of most basic end, and it's a way for countries to raise their population out of poverty. But it's not doing that in most of these countries. It's actually just keeping them in poverty and creating all sorts of other problems. Economic instability. By that, we have gone through an enormous rise. It was a huge part of the industry in this county and the one next door, and many others. And that is all, but and a huge chunk of that has gone away. There are the government's unemployment figures are a bit of a fudge. If you look at the level of economically inactive people, which is very different from so people that are unemployed are not the same as the people that aren't working. The figures are very, very different, but in Lancashire and Yorkshire, the number's about 23% of all people are not in work. But, if you added 1.7 million jobs back, obviously technology has moved us forward, but it has created dislocations that are very complicated and complex. But one of the things that really, really inspires me to try and look at ways of changing this is the role that these businesses played in, terrible pun intended, knitting these communities together. Those industries were a source of civic pride. They were a source of personal pride. People, as much as they might have moaned and groaned about going to work, this was the thing that bonded these communities together, and it bonded families together. And the loss of it it causes far, far more problems, I believe, than simply the loss of income. The loss of something to make us feel good. The work, manual work, in lots of recent studies, they found that people who do skilled manual jobs have much lower mental health levels of mental health problems, obviously more, physically fitter and healthier, and but there is that loss of purpose, that loss of a sense of identity is very, very keenly felt in many of the towns where we have suppliers in this industry. I think we've got to change it. I think that's the simple truth. I was looking at the table of suppliers. There's published data, the market shares in clothing in the UK. The top 20 of those vendors, a lot of those people, a lot of those businesses are in the model is such that, their model is to sell you something new every week. That is from wherever they went, they are now, from wherever they came from, today their model is, every day I'm going to show you stuff. I'm going to make you buy some new stuff every week. And it's cheap. And I'm going to keep trying to make it cheaper because everyone else is making it cheaper. And I think there are some people on that list that have the opportunity to change their model. And there are some of them that are already trying to do good things with a little bit of it. I mean, as much as I admire those people individually and I admire the efforts of small groups within those companies, I still can't help but feel that the model is so damaged that what we need to do is bring in something new. And I think that is an exciting prospect, and it creates all sorts of good opportunities. And I think it creates opportunities here. 64% of millennials, I think I'm a millennial, actually. I don't look like one. Everyone assumes millennials are very young, but we go all the way up to just about my age. 64% of millennials would rather wear a socially conscious brand than a luxury brand. Well, that's quite a good thing. And actually, in the conversations with students that I've had this afternoon, almost every single one of them is very much aware that creating a fashion industry that is more socially conscious, that is more sustainable, that is ethically more upright, I think is absolutely front and center of all of their minds. And 10 years ago, that would not have been the case. I've been, lecturing and doing conversations with students for a while now. They are all very tuned in to the idea that we have to create an industry that is cleaner, more ethically upright than it is before. I don't know where this expression ethically upright came from. I've just invented it. I apologize. It's a stupid expression. Anyway, like an upright citizen. I don't know. 73%, I don't know why I'm reading this to you. I can presume most of you have got very good reading and probably good enough eyesight, considering these letters are about the size of my head. 73% of millennials would pay more for sustainable products. I think there's something missing after pay and more. And I think it's the expression just a little bit. Because at the moment, I think we would all like to say, there's another statistic, 70-odd% of us would claim that we would like to support local manufacturing. But I think the big challenge is that we are used to paying so little for our clothing, and we benchmark everything we do against the guy at the bottom. We would all like to do better. We'd all like to shop better, but I think the great problem is it's all more expensive. And whenever it comes to the actual point of decision, I think the number of us that are prepared to pay more, if you had a choice between a really good thing and the same thing, but it was dripping in the blood of, dead turtles and, all this other stuff, you'd choose the good thing. But if I asked you to pay 10% more, probably 10, 20% of you are going to sort of turn a blind eye and buy the bad thing. And if I make it 20% more, I reckon 50% of you wouldn't. And if I make it 30% more, I reckon 90% of you would. We are not prepared to pay that much more, if anything at all, because when it comes to it, I don't know what happens. We just forget all the bad. I'll just, So that is the big challenge. We all would like to buy things that are different, in the way that they sort of treat, the way that they walk across the earth, and the way that they treat the human beings that make them, but we're not prepared to pay for it. Yet. We may never be. This was I came up with this thing. Is anyone here? I think I saw a gentleman wearing a community clothing raincoat. Thanks. Good for you. And I bet you feel proud wearing it. Good. You should do, and you can do. My career in fashion was described very briefly. I have a fairly unique insight into the world because, I run a tailor's in Savile Row that, manufactures a few hundred suits a year. We make everything by hand. We only make the things that people ask for and need. They last for 50 years. We repair them, we alter them, we let the trousers out. Occasionally we pull the trousers back in again, but that's pretty rare. But if you came in and turned the power off, we could keep making the stuff. It's an extraordinarily sustainable, environmentally friendly business. But it's bloody expensive and nobody can afford it. So I also do a men's ready-to-wear collection, which I'm wearing today. So we do this stuff. The Japanese love it. I know you don't, but, it's... We make all of this stuff in fantastic factories in the UK using really premium materials. And so I've got brilliant connections with lots of amazing factories. I know them really quite well. And I know their ups and downs. I also do a collection with Debenhams. We sell about 500,000 garments a year, and we make them in factories across the world, a lot of them in Asia. So I know how good these factories are, and I know how hard some of them work to make their product good, sustainable, ethical. We pay more for our yarns because because the spinner that we use in China has done all that work to make sure that stuff is good. And but so I see that side, and I know what customers are prepared to pay. I know from conversations with Debenhams that we do a raincoat that's 110 quid, and the price of manufacture goes up because of Brexit, and the conversation is, well, can we put the price up? And if we put the price up, nobody's going to buy the thing. People are very sensitive to price. I've also been a manufacturer. I also own a manufacturer. I'm still a manufacturer. So I have a factory in Blackburn that makes clothes. Made this. And we make in the last 4 years, we've manufactured for Marks and Spencer's and John Lewis. And so I have an understanding of what it is like to be a supplier to this industry. I'm sitting wearing multiple hats and have a fairly interesting insight into all of this. So knowing what I know about people's desire to do better, and knowing what I know about people's desire to pay more for anything, I sat down and thought, well, how on earth can you solve all of this? And I came up with the idea for this business, which I've called community clothing. There are three really big things we do. Oh gosh, I'm going to create feedback. No, I am going to need my clicker. I'm going to have to stay over here. One of the really big issues. This is what the sort of demand curve on most British factories, even the very best British factories, have tons of quiet time. Most British factories are still supplying to people that have autumn, winter season, spring, summer season. And as a result, they're super busy. You can't get enough stuff out the door for 2 or 3 months. And then they're quiet for 2 or 3 months, 3 or 4 months. Busy again, quiet again, busy again. And of course, all of that spare capacity is economic badness to them. So what we do is we make our stuff in these factories in that quiet period. So we design and develop all of our stuff, and we don't change it. And we say, whenever you're quiet, make stuff for us. And whenever you're busy, you go do what you've got to do to, So the result is that we fill these factories up all the year round. We also have a really, really short supply chain. So we sell a very basic T-shirt. Raw cotton comes into Manchester to a place in Duckenfield, a company called English Fine Cottons. Spun there, drives down, it goes down the road to Leicester where it's knitted. It then goes across Leicester where it's finished, comes back up the road to Blackburn where it's cut and sewn, and that's where it stays and where it's distributed from. It's a very, very short and simple supply chain. We have one factory per product. We work with it's long-term relationships. It's all the stuff that, people like Marks and Spencer's used to do up until 20 years ago. Build synergistic relationships with a simple supply chain. Everybody knows their place in the supply chain and everything is good and understood. The other really big thing that we do is I don't know how many of you know this, but roughly speaking, if you spent 100 quid on a piece of clothing from a retailer on the British High Street, you're probably getting about 25 quid's worth of product and about 75 quid's worth of all of this other stuff. It might be more like 22 to 78. But there's not an awful lot of actual sewing, textiles, all the rest of it. And then when you think that, the prices you're paying, there's not an awful lot going to the manufacturer. We don't believe you need to do any of that. We believe you can just simply get rid of all that stuff. And how do we do that? Well, we don't design a new collection every season. We design a lovely Mac, and we say we've done the best job of designing the Mac, and by the way, we have the fewest number of seams, and we don't have pocket flaps and, all the extra bells and epaulettes and doodahs and zips inside. We have the fewest, we simplify everything, and we make it in fantastic factories out of the best fabrics we can find. And we don't pay Instagram influencers 15,000 quid to post it on their Instagram. And, when we don't ship it from the other side of the world, and we don't do all the other stuff. Also, we don't have any retail, and retail is a big cost. If you go to a shop, if you go to Debenhams or Marks and Spencer's, the cost of that store is quite significant. So we cut all of that out. The web has enabled all of this, so we're what's called a direct-to-consumer brand. But essentially, we take it from the factory and we sell it to you, and we just mark it up a really tiny amount. And we're an incredibly lean organization. So that's the sort of normal model at the top: design, supply chain, marketing, retail. All that stuff costs money, and we don't do any of that because we've just designed the best version of the one thing that we're selling you. And, we might make it in a different color next year, but we'll always have the navy blue one, we'll always have the beige one. And, if it's a jumper, we'll also have gray. But, we might do a couple of natty colors for summer. But, we're using the same yarn from the same suppliers. It's long-term stuff. It's not having to re-engineer the supply chain every 5 minutes because, we're always chasing we're always trying to chase a penny. Big cost in all of these, the supply chain management of the big high street retailers is if they're being asked to pursue ever-decreasing margins, they're going to have to find new. The cost of finding and auditing and putting all these suppliers on, it's a big, big cost. We cut all of that stuff out. What does the next generation of clothing look like? I think it has to look very different from the way it looks today. I'm glad I've got that bottom point on there because anyway. I think it has to be sustainable. We're running out of space in the ocean for all the garbage we're creating. This isn't just fashion. This is everything that we consume. It has to be ethical. I think we are reaching a point. Remember all the things we said about Britain's factories in the days of the dark satanic mills. We shoved that, we closed our eyes and pushed it to the other side of the world. But the world's a small place now, and we see what's happening. And I think consumers are, again, they don't want it. If they had a better choice, I think they would take it. we need to be more traceable. We need to be more transparent. This is all happening. Consumers of, food is leaps and bounds ahead of us. Everybody understands, you want to see a picture of the cow in the field where your milk comes from, and there's Robert Graham standing next to his sister milking a cow, and we want that in food, but we're starting to want that in fashion as well. And the technology is there to do it, but getting all of these big suppliers to jump on board and open the books and show you where it all comes from. I mean, it would be an awful lot of work. I asked Debenhams the question whether they could actually do it if they wanted to, and I think the response was quite positive. I think there will be others, there will be lots of others, certainly down the bottom end, who would have enormous difficulty tracing things all the way back. They might know who they bought it from, but what happens beyond, they're not so keen on. I think we can change fundamentally the way. I think technology has moved on so much, we no longer need to make things on the other side of the world. I think the cost imperative for manufacturing in cheap labor cost regions is disappearing as technology is improving. I think our fashion businesses need to be, or our clothing businesses need to be socially conscious. I think that's really, really clear. And a lot of this change has to be driven by technology. That is the answer. And, people forget that textile technology is moving forward at a continuously enormous rate. And there are solutions in all of that to all of the problems. I am certain of it. This is a mill called Hainsworth, which is a vertically integrated mill, not a million miles away from there. They're a supplier to Community Clothing, and to eTorts, and to Norton & Sons. We love them. They're a family-owned business. I think they're 7th or 8th generation. But the idea that textile production, this is probably not the fanciest machine. I was trying to I was like, send me some pictures of your sexiest machines. And that's actually what I said. I got this one, the sexiest operator, obviously, but... this is what, people think about textiles and clothing manufacturing, and they think of, the factory in Coronation Street with the ladies in their floral tabards and, dirty mill buildings and brick. I mean, the truth is these are super high-tech businesses, or the good ones are, and this is the future, because this technology is fundamentally changing the economics of producing the clothing that we need. And, this is English Fine Cottons in Duckenfield, who are also a supplier to Community Clothing. So the spinning for the T-shirts is done there. It's a brand new mill. It's built inside a really old mill. You walk inside, it's, inside there's all this whiz-bang kit. And about 6 million quid's worth. And the mill, the spinning side of the mill operates with 4 people. You don't need, we can make a T-shirt. The technology exists to make T-shirts. It's not even crazy. The most, a state-of-the-art factory can make a T-shirt in 4 minutes. So even in this country, at a good rate of pay, that's still well less than £1's worth of labour in a T-shirt. And, add the jersey to that, it's perfectly possible for us to make clothes in this country, but we have to invest in the technology, we have to invest in the skills. There are plenty of people with plenty of money here, and we've got the space. There's empty mill buildings aplenty. We can do this, but we have to change the way. There is no longer, it no longer makes sense to make stuff on the other side of the world. If we can invest in the newest technology, we can make the clothing we need right here. That's a machine that sews pockets. These pockets were sewn on that machine. Technology is not only changing the economics of manufacturing textiles, but it's changing the economics of manufacturing clothing. I mean, this machine, it's got a laser, and it's it's even got a warning sticker on there. But it's, technology is changing all of this stuff. And, the future of our industry, I think, looks very, very different. We're not going to turn the clock back to the industrial economy of our past. We're not going back to 1.7 million people. The technology means that what was produced by those 1.7 million people can probably easily be produced by 170,000. But that 170,000 is an awful lot better than the 40,000 we've got today. And we know that that everyone will be paid properly. We know that the dyestuffs will be looked after. We know that the effluent, we know that, if you're making stuff in Europe, European laws on environmental standards in manufacturing are amazing. And if we make stuff here, we'll know it's good. We'll know it's doing great things for our community. This is my lot from the Cookson and Clegg factory. I would love that everybody in the future was able to feel like our lovely gentleman there and feel proud of the clothing that we buy, because fashion used to bring us an awful lot of joy. And how can you feel joy in buying fashion when you know that the making of it is awful and the disposal of it is awful? That whole life cycle has a long way to go. And I believe we have a great opportunity to bring it back and to make everybody feel happy about and proud of the clothes that they're wearing. Thanks.